In this video, I'm going to talk a little bit about the coming of Euro-Americans to the El Paso del Norte region. Let me start by talking about the term Euro-American. It means Americans of European descent. For many years, the common word was Anglo, but people resisted saying that they were not English. They were not Anglo. They were from some other European country. So scholars began to use the term Euro-American. In order to understand the coming of Euro-Americans to this region, we need to go back to Mexican independence in 1821. Mexico had declared independence in 1810, and it achieved independence in 1821, 300 years after it was colonized by Spain. When Mexico became an independent nation, it had so many things to figure out, especially how to become economically independent. Now, at the same time, in the United States, beginning in 1819, there was an economic depression. So you have a country on one side of the border wondering how to stabilize economically, and a country on the other side of the border also trying to figure out how to stabilize economically. So the two needs came together after Mexican independence. As with any economic depression, businessmen needed a market for their goods, and American businessmen found that market in the newly independent Mexico. Mexico, on the other hand, wanted to have a trade partner, and it found that trade partner in the United States. So there began an economic relationship between Mexico and the United States that would lead eventually to Euro-Americans coming to El Paso del Norte. As I've said, the majority of the settlements up until this point were on the southern side of the Rio Grande. So you have especially El Paso del Norte, or Ciudad Juárez as we know it now. You have Isleta, Senecu, Socorro, which later end up on this side of the river. And in the 1820s, 30s, 40s, and 50s, Euro-American men start to come to this region, and the landscape begins to change. In 1827, the Ayuntamiento, or the City Council of El Paso del Norte, gave a land grant to Juan Maria Ponce de Leon. And this land grant was located more or less where Barrio Duranguito is today, that we talked about in week 1. The land was described as fertile. There were orchards and vineyards. There was livestock. He had numerous buildings on the land. There were acequias, or irrigation canals. Juan Maria Ponce de Leon eventually sold his land to a man named Franklin Coons, and Coons renamed the land to Coons Rancho. Franklin Coons also gave the name to the settlement of Franklin. So we have the Franklin Mountains in El Paso, named after Franklin Coons, probably. You also had Concordia, where Concordia Cemetery is now. You had Hart's Mill, which is off of Paisano near UTEP. And these settlements that are on the north side of the river, that are founded by Euro-American men, but often using the wealth and land holdings of their wives, who were from wealthy Mexican families, are the beginnings of El Paso, Texas. Let me talk about what first brought Euro-American men to what was back then the Mexican North. A few minutes ago, I talked about these economic needs on both sides of the border. There was the economic depression on the U.S. side, with business people looking for a market. There was Mexican independence on the southern side of the border, with this brand new country trying to figure out how to stabilize financially. And these two needs came together to create what we know as the Santa Fe Trail or the Santa Fe Chihuahua Trail. The Santa Fe Trail created enormous profits for American business people and also brought profits to elite northern Mexicans. The trade began in St. Louis, Missouri. It was cheaper, quicker, and easier to transport manufactured goods from St. Louis, Missouri to northern Mexico than it was to transport them from Mexico City to northern Mexico. Mexico is an extremely mountainous country, and to transport anything on land over the mountains was not only very time-consuming, but also very costly. So as you can see on this map, you have trade starting at St. Louis, going westward to Santa Fe, and eventually down to Chihuahua. So you have this influx of Euro-American men into the Mexican North as business people, and they follow the route of men who had come who were trappers, fur trappers, and who had documented the Mexican North. One of the ways in which newcomers could build their wealth when they came to the El Paso del Norte region was by intermarrying into wealthy northern Mexican families. So you have a number of local power couples in the early 19th century. From the 1820s to the 1850s, you have Euro-American men intermarrying into local, very wealthy, politically and business connected families, and I'm going to tell you about a few of them. I want you to be sure to look at the section on the McGoffin home, because Mr. McGoffin was the son of one of these intermarriages, but in San Antonio. So this happened not just in the El Paso del Norte region, it happened in Texas, and it happened also in New Mexico. Here I introduce you to the Juanita Marquez Bendawa family. Juanita Marquez was the daughter of a Tigua cacique, or tribal leader, who married Ben Dowell, a man from Kentucky, in the 1850s. Ben Dowell had been in the military in the U.S.-Mexico War in the 1840s. He ended up coming to El Paso, where he was given land for his military participation. He married into this very powerful Tigua family, and he became the first mayor of El Paso after El Paso incorporated in the 1870s. He also was in charge of the first federal customs house, which was in a building on the corner of 3rd Street and South Oregon. And here you can see their children. And like so many other families of intermarriage, the children, some look like their dad and some look like their mom. One looks like a mixture of both. And you can see Ben Dowell's very striking white hair. So they say that he was totally white-haired by the time he was 31. I imagine that most of you know where Concordia Cemetery is, under the Spaghetti Bowl in central El Paso. Well, what we know now as Concordia Cemetery was once part of a much larger tract of land called Concordia Ranch. In the 1820s, a man by the name of Hugh Stevenson came from Kentucky, and he intermarried into a very wealthy, very prominent family from El Paso del Norte, the Azcárate family. He married Juana Azcárate, and as a consequence, he and Juana were able to acquire a huge tract of land which had been part of a land grant given to her family by the Mexican government, or actually by the Spanish government. It's that old. He named it Concordia after Concordia, Missouri, where he used to live. So sometimes we think of it as a very Spanish-sounding name, Concordia, but it's not. It's from Concordia, Missouri. Because of his intermarriage with the Azcárate family, he was able to build his own wealth. Juan Azcárate and Hugh Stevenson had a daughter named Venancia Stevenson. And Venancia Stevenson built a home in what is now Barrio Duranguito. So you can see how everything is connected. You have a family from what is now Juarez. You have a man from Kentucky marrying into that family, but building a settlement on the northern side of the river. The next generation builds a home in Barrio Duranguito. Also, several of their children were supporters of the Confederacy during the Civil War. So it's all very complex what's happening with the coming of Euro-Americans and the intermarriage of Euro-Americans and Mexican women. The last family that I'm going to mention is Simon Hart and Jesusita Siqueiros. Simon Hart came to El Paso and intermarried again to a very wealthy family from the other side of the river, the Siqueiros family. And he became one of the wealthiest men in El Paso del Norte. He was a supporter of the Confederacy. At one point, he offered the Confederate States a loan, which would be the equivalent of about $1 million today. The Harts were slave owners, and often we don't think about people in El Paso as being part of slavery. But some of these early prominent families in El Paso were slave owners. So if you look at the 1860 census, you see the Simon Hart family, and then you see the enslaved people listed. They only have first names, they don't have last names. Jesusita Siqueiros and Simon Hart had a number of children. One of them was Juan Hart. Juan Hart was both the founder and the first editor of the El Paso Times, and he had an office in Barrio Duranguito. So let's sum up what is happening then, beginning in the 1820s. You begin to have Euro-American men come to northern Mexico for business opportunities to gain wealth. They're coming into places like El Paso del Norte, intermarrying into wealthy, prominent families from northern Mexico and building their own wealth. The children of the intermarriages then are very interesting because they are possibly bicultural. Some identify as Euro-Americans, some identify as both. You have people supporting the Confederacy. You have what are called the pioneer families of El Paso, Texas, owning enslaved people. And you have in these early years, 1820s, 30s, 40s, 50s, the beginning of what becomes El Paso, Texas. It's still very tiny. It doesn't really boom until the coming of the railroads in the 1880s. But these are the roots of early El Paso, Texas.